Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Estates LLC. This is Craig Booksby here, coming to you live from North Carolina. Today, there's three things I want to talk to you about, and actually I want to weight those against 70% of ARV minus repair costs. So what we're going to break down today is we're going to talk a little bit about after repair value and what that means, and then a definition that I've created that is much more effective if you are in the business of flipping, buy and hold investing, or things to this nature. So let's first break down the definition of 70% of ARV minus repair costs. So what ARV stands for is after repair value. So let's break down what after repair value is. Basically, there's an industry term out there, and what people have done is they have come up with this term called after repair value, and it's kind of become an industry standard to the people who are traveling on the circuit or who are writing books. It's kind of a standard now, even where the lenders will talk about it, and that is after repair value, ARV. And so let's dig into a little bit about what this means. Normally, when you go out and you purchase a property, what you do is you go in and you look at and you assess the renovation. So you go in and you say, hey, this property looks like it's going to need about $50,000 in renovations. It's going to need carpet, paint, hardware, appliances, electrical, plumbing, and you're going to develop your scope of work, right? And so as an example, if you purchase an asset that let's say as an example is going to cost you $50,000. So you buy a little condominium somewhere in a town and you pay $50,000 for it, and then you estimate that the repairs are going to be $20,000. So it's going to take paint, carpet, appliances, hardware, maybe some flooring or whatever it is. Whether you're going to use a luxury vinyl plank or you're going to use a stone plastic composite. And that's the newest term out there on flooring, a stone plastic composite, or SPC. So if you're going to put new flooring in, new carpet in, new paint, hardware, electrical, plumbing, whatever it is that your scope is, let's just say, for example, that this costs you $20,000. So if your acquisition is $50,000 and your repairs are $20,000, you are all in at $70,000 for those two things. It may also involve other things such as closing costs, but as a general rule, after repair value just simply takes into account what you purchase it for and then what the renovations are going to cost. So what you purchase it for and what your renovations are going to cost you. So for a simplified example, if you paid $50,000 to purchase the property and your renovation costs were $20,000, the total combined cost would be $70,000. Let's say that the condominium or the townhome would resell on the retail market at $100,000. Okay? The comp value, meaning the $100,000 or the comparable market and analysis, that value that's determined normally by a real estate agent or someone who has experience, such as myself or someone who's been in the business for a long time, what you would do is you would look at the comp value. And in this case, we would say that we're going to comp it at what I call a level of P2. In my ranking system, within our system, what we do is we rank things based on phase of renovation. I rank things based on a P1, a P2, and a P3. A P1 is little to no renovation. A P2 is a mid-range renovation, and a P3 is a high-range renovation. And there can be pluses and minuses. So a phase 1 renovation can be a P1 minus, a P1, and a P1 plus. A high-end renovation could be a P3 minus, a P3, or a P plus. With phase of renovation, there are technically 9 terms: a P1 minus, a P1, a P1 plus, a P2 minus, a P2, a P2 plus, and a P3 minus, a P3, and a P3 plus. So they're basically, in the system that I have, 6 ranking designations of phase of renovation, or in other words, the P with the number. one being the worst type of renovation or little to no renovation, and a P2 mid-range and a P3 high-end. Just to get into that a little bit more, basically it depends on your neighborhood as to what that actually means. So as an example, if I'm in a high-end neighborhood, a P3 means steam showers, heated floors, 8-foot doors or taller, expensive carpet, all of the things that are considered to be high-end. It could be a spa, it could be a sauna, it could be a jacuzzi tub, right? It could be high-end door locks that are $200 to $400 or $1,000 a piece. So a P3 renovation in a high-end neighborhood would consist of some of those types of terms or definitions. However, in a war zone or an area where it's a lower income housing, a P3 renovation could simply mean solid surface countertops, good floors, paint, carpet, and it's decorated nicely. So it depends on the neighborhood you're in as to what phase of renovation is going to be considered a P3 as opposed to a P1. Okay, so back to after repair value. What they do is they look at construction designation, and in this case we're going to say that the scope is developed around a P2 renovation, meaning a phase 2 renovation, or in other words, the renovation is just going to be a medium renovation, not to the top and not down at the bottom. So it's just going to kind of be, your normal type of renovation that would facilitate that type of marketplace. So on a $100,000 home, a P2 renovation may be paint and carpet and floors with some hardware change out, and that's about it, right? Because that area may be designated for that type of a renovation. Another term I always use is called let the market speak to you. What I mean by letting the market speak to you is when you go into a community or a neighborhood, the thing that you should do is you should run your comps based on how the market is speaking to you. A lot of times when I go in and I run a comp on a property, I'm looking at what that neighborhood generates or what it tells me that the market is willing to accept. That's what's called letting the market speak to you. So if I go into a neighborhood and I see that Formica countertops are standard, then that's the market speaking to me that that neighborhood does not support granite, it supports Formica countertops. Then you can go into different levels, right? So it may be that it's a Formica countertop that looks like granite as opposed to a standard Formica countertop. When you look in a neighborhood, what you want to do is you want to see what are all the houses in the neighborhood doing? How are they selling? Are they painting it? Are they doing high-end hardware? What do their flooring looks like? What do their countertops look like? What do their cabinets look like? How does the exterior of the house look? All of these things create an environment that's conducive to that specific neighborhood. So it's extremely critical that you let your market speak to you. You go in and you look at the other houses in the neighborhood and you see how they sold and what they looked like when they sold. In North Carolina, as an example, you can park on the lawn, where in the West you would never do that because there's 2 or 3 times sprinklers are coming on a day. But in North Carolina, you can actually have a lawn that looks okay and that the cars park on that lawn, and that could be considered an acceptable standard in that neighborhood. And the lawn could be unkept, relatively speaking, to where in the West you would have sprinklers on that lawn. It would be full fescue. It would look extremely well manicured, as opposed to North Carolina where you can park on the lawn because the rain waters the yard and it grows like a forest, and so it's considered to be acceptable to have a yard that doesn't look as great. Where out in the West that may not be a great standard. So what you do is you let your market speak to you. When your market speaks to it, tells you how you should renovate. A lot of times what people do is they over renovate or they may under renovate. So you don't want to over renovate because if the neighborhood supports Formica and inexpensive carpet and a paint job, you don't want to go in there and put granite and 8-foot tall doors and yada, 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 right? So at the end of the day, what you want to do is make sure that your renovation is in line with the neighborhood. If your renovation is not in line with the neighborhood, it can make a big difference because you may be putting too little money or too much money into the asset to renovate it. So moving on, basically what we're talking about is a mid-range renovation, which may include new carpet, new paint, some hardware change out, and that's considered a mid-range renovation on a $100,000 property. So if the comp value is $100,000, or your after repair value, or the way that you're going to renovate it so that it fetches $100,000, or that market demands or commands $100,000, then that is your after repair value, i.e. mid-range renovation for that neighborhood. You're going to do construction or mid-range renovation for that neighborhood. And with a mid-range renovation, you're going to comp at $100,000. So let's put this together. What you have is 70% of after repair value. So the after repair value is $100,000 at a mid-range renovation, and you're getting 70% is what your number is that you're trying to hit as far as your cost in, i.e. your purchase price and your renovation. So in this particular example, your purchase price is $50,000, your mid-range renovation is $20,000, the two combined is $70,000, and your comp value or your resale value is $100,000. In this example, you are 70% of after repair value. So as we look at that, the thing that I see with after repair value and 70% of after repair value, a lot of the people out there say you need to buy at 50 if your renovation is 20 and your comp value is 100. And so this is a very simple equation that people can use to go in and identify whether it's a buy or not. It's considered what you would call an industry standard in the RIA markets, or in the guru markets, or in the markets where people are selling you some type of education. I believe that that equation is fundamentally flawed. And the reason I say that is because after repair value doesn't get you where you need to go. So I'm going to now introduce to you the terms I use in the industry that I've coined that I think are very specific to renovation. And what I look at is three terms, and they are called renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. Okay, so renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So you could call that RRT, right? So renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. Why do I use those terms, and how do I feel those work better? Okay, so the reason that renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time work much more effectively is because at the end of the day, what they do is they give you a very technical evaluation of what it is you're trying to accomplish. And they fit much better, and they're also very easy to remember. RRT, renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So let's dive into these meanings. If you go to an old house that was built in 1949 and you buy that home, your renovation risk is going to be extremely high. You're going to be changing out electrical wiring, you're going to be changing out plumbing, you're going to be having floor issues and ceiling issues and roof issues. If you buy a house that's built in the downtown area or out in the country, it's going to have what we call a high renovation risk. If it's a very old home, say built 1978 or older, that would be considered a very high renovation risk. Because the older the home gets, the more problems that most likely it will have. A lot of times there will be people that will do a dual layer roof, as an example. Okay, so someone goes in and roofs it once, they go in and put the roofing right over the top, asphalt shingles. If you have a dual layer roof, it can be acceptable in your area, and that basically means what you're doing is you have old asphalt shingles and you just simply relay over another layer of asphalt shingles. The same thing that can happen in the interior of a home. So you may have where a house in the olden days was done with plaster and lath. So basically you're taking a sheet of metal and then you're nailing it to the wall, and then you're putting plaster over it and then doing a finish coat. So back in the olden days, a lot of houses were done with plaster. They were also done with old black pipe, as an example, and their wiring is extremely old. And you may end up with copper tubing or even galvanized tubing for plumbing. All of these things make it very risky when you do a renovation. Okay, so one of the terms I use is You gauge your house based on the risk of renovation. And normally this is tied out with how old or young the house is. If you have a house that's built in the 1920s, as an example, the odds are that it's already met its construction life. It's built out of block, it has plaster, the framing is different, the plumbing and the electrical are very different. Renovation risk is extremely important, where on the other hand, if you bought a house that was built in 2018, the renovation risk would be very low because you have new drywall, new framing, new air conditioning, new roofing. Your risk is extremely low because in that case, you're buying a home that's newer in years, so it will most likely not have any major issues, and everything in between. So you could have a 1920s home that has all kinds of risk, or a 2018 home that has very little risk. And during the years, you had things that changed, such as there were houses that were built with asbestos. And if a house has asbestos in it, there's all kinds of things you have to do in order to renovate. Another term that we see common is 1978 or newer, or 1978 and older. Why was that a major year in building? Because in 1978, they did away with lead-based paint. Okay, so if you buy a home that's 1978 or older, you have certain requirements that you must do or follow if you're going to paint an older house. Where if it's newer than 1978, then it no longer has lead-based paint. They stop selling it, and because of that, any house that's after 1978, you don't have a lead-based paint issue as a general rule. Very important terms back in the day of asbestos, 1978, brought in the era of non-lead-based paint. Another one we have is Wiersbo. In the 1990s, they came out with a plumbing that was no longer copper or metal. Plumbing went from copper pipe to Wiersbo, or a gray type of piping, where it was a polypropylene, a substrate made of some type of plastic that was gray. And that piping came in the 1990s, and then they found it to be an error, and there were many problems, and so the joints would break. And so we have the era of the 1990s, or right around there, where we ended up with the Wiersbo piping, or the polypropylene piping, or the piping that was considered to not be good piping. So as you go through the years in renovation, what you're looking for is renovation risk. In the 1920s, you could have a house that has asbestos, it could also have lead-based paint, and it could have been upgraded with a Wiersbo or a polypropylene type of piping, and all three of those would be considered defective materials. Therefore, your renovation risk would be much higher. Also, you can get into foundation issues. What I normally say is, if it's wider than a dime, if you can stick a dime in a crack, then you have a problem with it. And that's turning it sideways and sliding it in. So if you can put a dime in a crack, that means that there's a problem, usually. If it's less than a dime, then normally it's okay. So when you go to a house and you see foundation cracks, for instance, as an example, in Texas, in Houston, Texas, 1 out of every 3 homes has a foundation issue. And because of the soil there and that type of thing, it has a foundation issue. So it's critical that you identify cracks. Are there cracks in the foundation? Are there cracks in the walls? Are there cracks coming off doors? You're looking for cracks on a home, and you want to see what type of structural issues there are. So structure manifests itself through cracking. So as a general rule, when you have renovation risk that has cracks or major cracks wider than a dime, you're looking at major renovation risk through a foundation, how it affects the walls, how the house is framed, and the type of lumber they use. All of these become elements of renovation risk. So is there cracks? Is there asbestos? Is there the wrong type of plumbing piping? Or is there the problem with lead-based paint? These are issues that start to get into renovation risk. Another area you can have renovation risk is in air conditioning. So the average air conditioning system lasts about 15 years. It could be as little as 10 or it could be as much as 25. But if you're somewhere between the 12 and 15 year mark, it's time to change out that air conditioning unit. So if you're between 12 to 15 years, the odds are you're going to be changing out that air conditioning unit. Things that cost a lot of money when you're dealing with renovation risk are roofs. And as a general rule, a roof can be replaced for about $5 to $8,000, depending on how many square it is. A normal roof is about 30 years. You have 3-tab roof for shingles. So if we're talking shingle roofs, you would have a 3-tab roof, which is considered to be old and probably dated and maybe past its 30-year lifetime. The newest term is architectural shingles, and architectural shingles normally also have a 30-year lifetime. But as an example, an older roof could be 3-tab, a newer roof could be architectural shingles. If you're over in the West, you have concrete tiles. It's a completely different market, and there are metal roofs which have a tendency to last past 50 years, where a shingled roof could be 15 or 30 years or 25 years. A metal roof has a much longer lifespan. And the same with tile roofs or slate roofs, which are even more high-end. All right, so getting back to the dynamics of renovation risk, what you're looking at is if you bought a home that was in the 1940s and you went in to renovate it, your risk would be much higher based on the possibility of there being more things wrong with it, as opposed to buying a 2018 home where there would be very little renovation risk. The next topic we're going to get into is rate of return. If you purchase a home and you buy it for $50,000 and your renovation is $20,000, so you're into the asset for $70,000 and you sell it for $140,000, then you got 100% return. You invested $70 and you sold for $140, so you got 100% gross return, right? So that would be considered an extremely good deal. If you can put $70,000 into an asset, pay $50,000 for it, put $20,000 in renovation, and flip it for $140,000, then you have a gross return of $140,000. That would also be known as rate of return, or how much you're going to make in profits on the property when you sell it. Okay? And so what you're looking at on the definition of rate of return is, what type of spread am I going to have? Am I going to be all in at 70 and sell for 140? Am I going to be all in at 70 and sell for 100? Am I going to be all in at 70 and sell for 200,000? So your rate of return, basically, for my definition, is the amount of spread you get on the asset. Okay? So at the end of the day, how much are you all in for, and what are you going to sell for? And that gives you your rate of return. And so it's critical that you understand that you're looking at your rate of return, your spread, or how much gross profit you're going to make on the asset. So if you invest $70,000 in and the comp value is 140, or that's what you're going to resell it for, then you have 100% spread based on your costs and all-in costs. And so in this particular example, if you have a $70,000 home, all in, 50 in purchase, 20 in renovation, you're all in at 70 grand, we'll say for purposes of this discussion, and you sell for 140,000, then your gross return or your gross spread is $70,000, or it's 100% profit. So that's what we consider rate of return. The rate of return is how much money you are going to make gross on the property, gross profit. Now you'll notice that the term I'm using is gross. That's much different than net. But for purposes of this example, we're going to stay to a gross definition. The next thing we're going to look at is turn time. So if you buy a house, for instance, I purchased a property the other day. I renovated it within about 3 weeks. I actually had it done in about 4 days. So I had a property that I bought in Raleigh, in North Raleigh. I got a deed from the homeowner, and it was in disrepair. It's kind of interesting. The contractor was the guy who sold me the house. Didn't want to repair it because he didn't have the money to repair it. So I purchased a property in Raleigh. I picked it up. I had my teams in there and out of there in about 4 days. That wasn't the problem. The problem came in with getting the contractors to do the last 10%. So it's really interesting. What I always say is there's a 90-10% rule. The 90% 10% rule is everyone rushes in and gets the job done, and 90% of it's complete. But to get people back to do that last 10% that everyone forgets or says, I'll do that later, the 90% rule is everyone comes in, knocks the house out, and then after that I had a leak in the ceiling, this was wrong, that was wrong, and it took me another 3 weeks to get the renovation complete because of the last 10%. So that's extremely important. Then when you're renovating a home, what you do is you make sure that you get your trades in on time and that they're stat on and spot on, and that you make sure that they get each trade done 100%, and that you require them to come back and finish the last bit before they get paid so that you can get your turn time down. So turn time is based on the fact of when you closed on it A to B, i.e. you purchased it from A, the individual, and B is you, so you now own that asset. So it's an A to B purchase. Once you've purchased it A to B, or what I will call your first closing deed. A lot of times what I look at is I look at deed to deed time. Deed to deed time means what you do is you bought the asset from A and you're B, and so you now close on it. And then B, you go through the renovation process, and then B sells it to C, which is your retail buyer. So you have an A to B transaction, which is you closing with whoever you purchased it from. And now the B to C transaction is you're closing with the individual who you're going to retail or who you're going to sell it to. That brings up the next definition, which is called deed to deed. That's the term I use, is what was your actual time deed to deed? So I closed it on, for instance, in this example, let's just say I closed on it on April 1st. My renovation took me 30 days, so now I'm at May 1st. My renovation took 30 days, so I completed on May 1st, and that's also when I listed it on the market, and then I sold it on June 1st. That would be roughly a 60-day deed to deed time. If I purchased it on April 1st, my renovation took 30 days and I was completed on May 1st, and then I listed it on May 1st. Then I went and sold it and closed on it by June 1st. That would be a total time of around 60 days. So that's my deed to deed time. A to B and B to C closings are critical to your equation. And the reason why is because then you know, when did I close A to B and when did I close B to C? And those are your marking points based on the Register of Deeds or wherever you record that deed, because that shows when you bought it and closed on it. That's normally when your funding comes in if you're financing it. And then when you sell it B to C, that's when you terminate or end your service on that property and you sell it out to the retail buyer. So a deed to deed time is extremely critical in the equation. And the reason why is we want to know how fast you're going to turn that asset. In this particular case, I bought it, got it done and renovated in 3 weeks, put it on the market, had a 10-day marketing period. After that 10-day marketing period, which put me at roughly a little over 30 days, I was then into my closing, which actually took 2 weeks in this case. And because I had a cash buyer with no inspection, so in that particular case, I closed 2 weeks later. So my total deed to deed time in this example was, let's call it 50 days or 45 days. Okay, so let's back up and see where we're headed here. So number one, we have our renovation risk, and then we have our rate of return. So renovation risk is how much renovation is there? And then you have rate of return, which is how wide is your spread, how much margin, gross margin is in that asset. And then your third thing is your turn time. How quickly did you sell? When did you buy at A to B? When did you close at B to C? That's your deed to deed time, which then in turn tells you your full turn time. Okay, so now that we've kind of put those three together, what you have is your renovation risk, your rate of return, and your turn time. This starts to really get into the detail of your renovation, of your project. It's speaking to how much renovation it's going to take. It's speaking to what your margins or profits are going to be. And then it's speaking to how quickly are you going to close after you buy it. And so these are the elements that really, in my opinion, blow away this 70% of ARV minus repair costs. And the reason why is because it gets specific to the actual project and what you're doing on that project. So let me give you two examples that deal with renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So if I bought a 1920s home in a downtown area of, let's say, Charlotte, and I went in and went to renovate that home, by the time I pulled my permits, lined up the contractors, and got that job done, I'm looking at a 9-month period at the quickest. So once again, if I bought a 1920s home in downtown Charlotte, I would have to pull a permit. I may also have to go through a city architectural review. That's another thing, is you got to look at those review periods, right? So how long does it take you to get your permit? And then if there's any other kind of thresholds that you got to pass, such as city architectural reviews or HOA-induced architectural reviews. So as an example, if I purchase an asset in the downtown area that's in 1920s, I have to figure that I'm going to go through the city architectural review as well as the city county planning permit process, right? So you may have the city county permit process. So in this particular example, if I bought that home and my total time is 9 months in renovation, that's my quickest time. As we know, there are many projects, and I've seen them, where they buy a house and then they say they're going to pop the top. So they're going to buy a single story and then make it a 2-story. And the reason they're doing that is because their lot square footage is small, or the expense to that lot is small. And so basically what you're now doing is you're taking a single story and you're going to go in and open it up, put in a set of stairs, and then build upwards and pop the top, because the more square footage you get on that lot, the more value you bring by cost per square foot to sell the home. In a 1920s home, it may take you 9 months to get it done at your fastest pace, or it could take up to 2.5 years. I've actually seen renovations that have lasted 2.5 years, and when the people bought the home, they thought they were going to get that thing renovated within 90 days. Or 60 days or 30 days, right? So I've seen 90-day projects end up being 2.5-year projects. And the reason why is because it takes so much time to get everything done, because there were several things you didn't see that needed to be done or that happened. And that's your renovation risk, right? So if I buy a property in the 1920s and it takes me 9 months to renovate it, and my total all-in purchase and renovation is $70,000, and I resell it for $100,000, my gross profit's going to be $30,000. If it takes me 9 months to get that job done, and my spread is only $30,000 gross, and my turn time is now going to take me longer than 9 months because I now have to put it on the market and sell it, it could take me a year to get out of that asset. So if I purchased that property and the renovation risk was high because it was in the 1920s, and it takes me 9 months to get it renovated by the time I pull my permits and go through the architectural review committee for the city, and then my construction's going to last me 6 months, I could be a total of 9 months into the project. Then I list it on the market to sell, and if it takes me 3 months to sell it, my total time in, or deed to deed time, or my turn time is 1 year. So my renovation risk is high. My rate of return, gross profits is $30,000, is low, and the turn time is relatively high of 1 year. Now I really start to see what happens if I decide to take on a high risk renovation. So if you're going to go into high risk renovations, renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time, RRT, is critical to your plan. And the reason why is because you're going to be into that asset for a year, your profits are going to be low, and your risk is going to be high. If you're dealing with a 1920s home, and your margin, your gross margin is only $30,000, the odds are that you could burn up through all of that profit and end up making nothing or even receiving a loss because your renovation risk was so high. When you're looking at renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time, in the model that I just gave you, I talked about an old home that you were going to make a $30,000 gross profit on that was going to take you 1 year of time, and your all-in investment was $70,000. That is a terrible deal, but it met the requirement of the 70% of ARV minus repair costs. If you pick that house up for $10,000 and you had $60,000 of renovation into it, and it was a 1920s home that was only 800 square feet on a postage stamp lot, using the 70% ARV minus repair cost method on an old home is horrible, because you would go in there and you would run the math. You would say, listen, I met the requirements. I bought the house for 10 grand. My renovations were 60 and I made 100,000. So my total all in was 70 and my retail sale was 100,000, and I make a $30,000 profit. If you make a gross $30,000 profit on an asset that takes you a year to turn and has high renovation risk, what's the odds at the end of the day that you're even going to make the $30,000 gross profit, right? So in this particular example, 70% of ARV minus repair cost doesn't cut it. It's a bad idea. And so then what they'll come in and say is, well, if it's an old home, you do 50% of ARV minus repair costs. That's how they would adjust it down, is they would say, well, you buy at 50% of ARV minus repair costs. But the fact of the matter is the equation doesn't get you the facts. It doesn't run the numbers appropriately. It doesn't show you how to properly value a property. So in the example I used, a 1920s home with $60,000 in renovation that you paid $10,000 for the home. That's another thing that gets me, is a lot of times people will come in and they'll say, I just bought this house for $10,000. Well, I had a client of mine that paid $7,000 for a property. And you know what? It was a 1920s home or whatever it was. It was a real old home, and it was a small home. It took him 2.5 years to renovate that thing. It had all kinds of problems. He kept hiring and firing contractors. He spent too much money and everything. And the reason he spent too much money is because he tried to do it on the cheap and then had to keep getting it redone again. And so the other thing is when you get into a high-risk renovation property, you really have to understand that it's high risk for a reason. And it's going to cost you, and it can eat up your profit. And so that's the critical thing we're looking for here, is renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time told us that 1920s home that we paid 10 grand for and thought we got a deal had $60,000 in renovation potentially, and could be more, and your return on investment was $30,000 over a 1 year time. Imagine if that thing took you 2.5 years, right? Here you would be into an asset that you bought for 10, the renovation was 60, and it was high risk. So there was expected a $30,000 profit there on $100,000 ARV or comp value, right? And that $30,000 could be eaten up through burn rate. Let's talk about burn rate. Burn rate's a big one too, because it's part of the equation. What do we mean by burn rate? Well, it's real simple. If you take a dollar bill and you light it with a match, it's going to burn up. Okay? It's as though you're flushing your money down the toilet. The reason we use the term burn rate is that's how much money is burning up on a daily basis if you're in the middle of a renovation on a property. So let's dig into burn rate. If my financing costs for that $70,000 loan is 12% or $700 a month, let's just use it as an example. So here we go. Let's look at burn rate. What does that take into consideration? It's your financing costs. It's how much you're paying in taxes. Okay? It's your utility bills. It's your maintenance costs, your landscape maintenance costs, your bug spray costs. Anything you have to do to maintain that house is considered a burn rate. It's a cost that you have to carry that asset. It could be parking fees, it can be HOA fees. All of these things are costs that you pay to keep that home. So you could have your mortgage payment, your taxes, your insurance, your landscape maintenance. It could be a parking fee that you might have to pay. It could be an HOA fee that you have to pay. It's your utility expense, your internet expense, gas, water, power. All of these are expenses that you have to put into the project in order to get it done. Other things that can be considered burn rate are accounting staff and time. If you're in the middle of a renovation and you're bringing in invoices all the time, you have to pay an accountant on a monthly basis to turn your invoices and to get them up to where they need to be. And so that can even be considered part of the burn rate, right? And so with burn rate, it's all the cost to carry the asset over any given period of time. So what we do is we annualize the burn rate. So we take 1 year and we say, for 1 year, what are all our expenses? Because some things like taxes are paid yearly, right? You can prorate them, but at the end of the day, if you look at an annual burn rate, what you're looking at is how much are all the expenses over the term of a year. Let's say that number is $12,000 for that $100,000 home. If your burn rate is $12,000 a year, so your annual burn rate is $12,000. Your monthly burn rate is $1,000, and then you get your weekly and your daily burn rates, and that's factored out of that as well too. So in our system, what we prefer to do is we want you to track your burn rate. Burn rate is extremely critical, and the reason why, it's really easy when you're in the middle of a project to let time go. It's a day here, they need a little bit more time, can't show up today, they'll be here tomorrow, which turns into a week, which can turn into months, right? So you have people that show up and say, oh, we'll get it done right away, and then take longer, right? If every trade adds on a week of time to its trade, you will end up blowing your schedule completely out, and you will have a higher burn rate. So you want to look at burn rate as though you're putting gas in a car. When you put fuel in a car or in a jet, you have a burn of that fuel. It's like flushing dollar bills down the toilet, or it's like literally taking a match or a lighter and lighting dollar bills on fire. You're burning them up. And so your burn rate is the amount of money it costs to manage or maintain the asset in its entirety over a given specific time. So burn rate is extremely critical because it tells you how much money you are burning up on a monthly basis as you renovate that property. The other thing to keep in mind is most people don't keep burn rate in mind. So keep it in mind. It's critical. A lot of times people will la-di-da around thinking everything's fine, and pretty soon a week turns into a month turns into 3 months, and 3 months turns into a half a year, and half a year turns into a year. Burn rate can kill you. Let's go back to the example of a property that your after repair value is $100,000. Okay, so I've switched the example a little here. We're now talking about a property that you paid $10,000 for. You put $60,000 in renovation, so your total all in is $70,000, and your resale value is $100,000. That's 70% of ARV minus repair costs gives you your equation for what the industry says. Well, if you have a property that's a high-risk renovation and your burn rate is $1,000 a month and your gross profits are $30,000, if that project takes you a year, you're going to lose $12,000 in burn. So what does that teach you? Burn rate is absolutely critical. And I tell my clients that they should know their daily burn rate. They should know their weekly burn rate. They should know their monthly burn rate and their annualized burn rate, although they shouldn't really focus on that, right? So you should know what your burn is going into that project, how many HOA fees you're going to pay, utility expenses, accounting that you got to do monthly, all of these things, taxes, all of these different events are what you have to pay on a monthly basis. That shows you your burn rate. Extremely critical. So if you have a property that takes you a year to renovate, that you bought for $10,000, your renovation was $60,000, you're all in is $70,000, and your retail sell value is $100,000. If your burn rate is high and your project goes long, the burn rate can kill your profits. All right, let me give you another example: renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So what we've talked about is the old house and how it could go for a year, and if your profits were $30,000, they could be eaten up through a burn rate. That's the other thing you want to look at when you're doing renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time, because when you're doing a renovation, you can have scheduled profits of $50,000 or $30,000 or whatever your number is, and if you don't get that project done quick enough, you can burn right through your profits with your carry costs. So it's extremely important to pay attention to your turn times. And the reason why is because if you turn quickly, then your burn rate is less. It's extremely important that you're paying attention to your burn rate and your turn times, because that can eat up your profits. So as an example, if I'm going to renovate a house that has high risk renovation, I'm not going to want to buy it 70% of ARV, even though that's the standard in the industry. I might buy it 50% of ARV minus repair costs, meaning I'm all in at 50. I'm going to buy that house for 10. My renovations are 40, so I'm all in at 50, and it's going to sell for 100, so that's a gross 50,000 profit. That's a more acceptable after repair value. So the issue here that I'm getting into is 70% of ARV minus repair costs can get you in trouble on a high risk renovation. Let me give you another example. Let's say we buy a condominium. If I buy a condominium that's built in 2019, how quickly can I get that done, and what are my costs in it, and what does it mean? So if I purchased it at 70% of ARV minus repair costs, that condo was built in 2019, I could basically spend $60,000 buying it, 10 in renovation just to put some paint and carpet in it, and then I'm a total all in at 70 grand. And if I sold it for 100,000, that would be a huge profit. And the reason why is because if my renovation took me 1 week, because remember, condominiums, you don't have to do any of the exterior work. The HOA takes care of the outside of the home. So your roof, your siding, all of these things are, as a general rule, covered by the HOA. So if you go in and you renovated a condominium and you put 60,000 into it to buy it and 10 grand in renovations, which may even be considered high, you'd be 70% all in. If your renovation took you 1 week to do, and then you got that house on the market and flipped it 40 days later, your total all-in time would be 47 days. Okay, so if I renovated a condo that cost me 10 in renovation, some paint and some carpet, and my renovation time was 1 week, if I flipped that and I netted out a 30 grand gross profit, by the time I got into the condominium, I close A to B, I have 1 week of renovation, I put it on the market and use my 10-day marketing strategy, and then I flip it out to the other side and close 30 days later, I'm into that house 7 days for the renovation, 10 for the marketing strategy, that's 17 days, and 30 for the resell. I'm into that asset for 47 days. Okay? If I can sell a property in 47 days and make a gross $30,000 profit, I'll do that deal all day long. So now you see the example of two issues that come up into 70% of ARV minus repair costs. If you did a high-risk renovation project that took you a year and your profits were $30,000, as opposed to a low-risk renovation project that took you 1 week to renovate and you sold it 47 days later, each one netted out the same profit of $30,000. If you're lucky, because remember, the high-risk renovation can burn up that money through the burn rate, or it can burn up that money through renovation risk, right? So at face, they both made $30,000. Which one would you pick? You would be picking the condominium because your turn time was 47 days as opposed to 1 year. Hence, 70% of ARV minus repair costs as opposed to renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. So What is your real after repair value, right? At the end of the day, what I'm telling you is I can buy a condominium and put $85,000 into it and sell it for $100 and net out $7,000, and that's a great return if I did it in 47 days. In that case, my after repair value could be 85%, where in the old house example, it could be 50%. And so that's why I do not believe in 70% of ARV minus repair costs. What's the better term? Renovation risk, rate of return, and turn time. This is Craig Brooksby with the Estates LLC signing off. I'll see you guys on the flip side.